Okay, so we're up to the next session on liberty, the right to liberty. And again, don't forget, so I've added the word liberty here. And don't worry, it's not a superpower. All it means is his free motion. That imagery there, his motion. And even that is representative and symbolic of the will, which is where the word comes from in the Latin. And so just the free movement of the soul. Okay, so the nature of liberty, let's talk about definition, description, preconditions for liberty. I said I'm going to have like a running bibliography, if I remember. So here's another one. Friedrich A. Hayek, it's called The Constitution of Liberty. It's a big book, scary big book, impress your friends, intimidate your enemies, that stuff. But it's just a good book. But Hayek seemed to define liberty in a civil context as, quote, the possibility of a person's acting according to his own decisions and plans, in contrast to the position of one who was irrevocable, subject to the will of another. I think that's probably a typo on my part. Irrevocably subject to the will of another, who by arbitrary decision could coerce him to act or not to act in specific ways. Now, about that word, liberty, and its cognates, whether it's in English or you don't care about Latin, but just the way we use all these words like it, this one's worth bringing up because you have this confusion of labels. Authors like Hayek will use the word liberal. Not in a liberal manner, but just a different manner. Both about the classical economic model of, say, Adam Smith, laissez-faire economics, which we'll get to, and even free governments, liberal democracy. What do they mean by that? Well, they just mean free governments. That's all they mean. Why are they using that word? Well, they're using it because of that free motion against another kind of force that we're going to call coercion. And they used this word in a very opposite way to the way the word liberal became in the post-World War II era. And increasingly, we don't even use that word in the last 10, 15 years. We've gone back to the word progressive, which was used at the end of the 19th century for a different view. But anyway, don't worry about that so much. But just be aware of it when you read authors like that. But what Hayek does at first is he draws out other so-called freedoms. So I have on the board other so-called freedoms. And I'll just kind of shorthand what he's talking about. He wants to talk about an individual right first. But there are these other kinds, from least to the more ridiculous. Because these aren't ridiculous, these first two. But they're not the same thing as the natural right to liberty. Why would you bring it up? So that you don't confuse them. Because confusing them will lead to an increasing amount of mischief as you get to the one that's increasingly less like the original natural variety. So other so-called freedoms are often in a very different class and even contradictory, such that if they were sought, it would be at the expense of the original kind. Why do we do things like this? It's not just that they're different. Hey, let's get our terms right so we can have a discussion. That's important. But what Hayek's going to say, and many others like him, is that if you try for the counterfeit, you're going to contradict in real life and conflict with and undermine and then destroy the genuine article. You can't actually do both. You can't do the two-headed monster thing. You can for a while, but eventually it just doesn't go together. They're like oil and water. So, for example, Hayek examines political liberty first. People could think that they mean this natural right of liberty when they talk about political liberty. But again, we're here at step 2 at this point, so I'm glad this is right here, because that's exactly where you'd want to put it. This is, and remember we talked about democracy and republican, we will come back to that. Are you going to deny this group and that person the right to vote? Well, no, but what I'd like you to consider is that the vote is there to serve a higher end. But political liberty is all about that vote. So when you hear this, think pure democracy in that sense. Political liberty is that equal status in choosing either political representation or even laws. Think of a referendum on a ballot in a state, as opposed to even sending a representative. This, Hayek says, may either secure or erode individual liberty, right? Think about it. The freedom to vote away your freedom is also a freedom. That's a freedom. You are free to vote away your freedom. And it wouldn't, in one sense, at least in the immediate, it wouldn't be anything other than freedom. As one example, the territory between France and Germany was annexed under the Third Reich, but not by force in this sense. They chose, on the eve of World War II, to rejoin the Third Reich by a margin of 90.8%. 90.8% said to themselves, yep, I like the brown shirts and those nice red armbands. That's doing it for me. So the right to vote away your freedom is also a right and a freedom. Hayek adds that this confusion of popular choice over objective liberty, quote, has sometimes led people to prefer a despot of their own race to the liberal government of an alien majority. And it has often provided the pretext for ruthless restrictions of the individual liberty of the members of minorities, end quote. So in the very loyalist or officialist or tribalist or racist, anything that's, let's call it groupist, well, let's call it collectivist, because that's what it is. Any species of collectivism can then fall so in love with some collective designation, some label, some group belonging, that you exalt that to your own harm, because you are, whether you like it or not, an individual first, that most oppressed and neglected minority, the individual. So there is that kind of liberty, which is not all the same, and as we just said, can undermine that, can go against it. Secondly, there's also what Hayek calls metaphysical or subjective liberty. Metaphysical or subjective. By subjective, I just mean personal. So here you're dealing with a more psychological way of speaking about the free will. And that's not irrelevant to politics, but Hayek says that because it, quote, more closely related to, because it's more closely related to individual freedom, it is therefore more easily confounded with it. So this is a sneaky little bugger. This is actually so relevant to this because it's in you, it's in the man. And here we're talking about inhering in the person, right? And so you can easily be talking about, I'm talking about individual will, but you're talking about in psychological terms as an end in itself. This is more like what Jonathan Edwards wrote about in The Freedom of the Will, concerning the mind choosing, that which is calculated to be either higher or of the highest goal, with subordinate goals and all that good stuff. Well, that's relevant to this, but it's not the same thing. You're just talking about the mechanism and mapping out how it works. We're talking about a thing that God has police taped off and said, don't touch that or I'll kill you. And that's two very different things. And no conception has done more mischief, Hayek says, than scientific determinism. So your worldview is going to matter here too. Because scientific determinism, as he calls it, eradicates personal responsibility. So if your political theory is backed, I'm not going to appeal to the collectivists at this point because they don't care. But if you're a libertarian and an atheist, you might want to think twice about that. Because scientific determinism eradicates personal responsibility. And personal responsibility undergirds individual liberty. So it undermines the individual to both act virtuously and to correct vice. So it undermines moral action in society as well on a collective level. One has been reduced to some extraneous mass society. And finally, there's the most juvenile and dangerous of all that Hayek sort of comically, I guess, calls the liberty of omnipotence. But he doesn't mean it comical at all. In fact, read Thomas Sowell's book, A Quest for Cosmic Justice. Let's just call this SJW liberty. And it's not new. It was there in the French Revolution as well. Liberty, equality, fraternity. And what do you mean by that? Well, pretty soon, liberty doesn't mean the same thing that we mean by liberty. Liberty of omnipotence, what do we mean? We mean that childish wish that says to your parents every time you're going anywhere, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Utopianism applied to the will, the individual projected on the collective. The childish wish to have any and all obstacles removed from the pursuit of one's desires. Well, let's ratchet it up a little bit. Oh, that's unfair, Matt, because you're making that individualistic. Fine. The pursuit of what one thinks is the great society or a good society or the common good or the common welfare, or whatever you want to call it. So let's make it altruistic. You still have the same problem. You're still defining the will and reducing it to the removal of obstacles. Well, which obstacles? What's the trade-off? Things like that. So why would this be dangerous? Well, since it doesn't seem like something that adults could possibly mean by liberty, why would we be worried about it? Why would we put it in the same class of serious things to consider? Well, when the mind and the character have been debased in a culture, and in fact, grown adults can begin to equate freedom with power. And how do they do this? Well, they do it in a lot of ways, and we'll look at John Stuart Mill in a second and an observation he made both about the French Revolution and sort of the Hegelian idea of the collective will, which we'll talk about in a second. But liberty requires some things. The real thing, the genuine article, if we're interested, it does have some prerequisites. But even those prerequisites can start to merge into these. It requires a private sphere. Well, you can kill somebody in private, see, but it still requires a private sphere. It requires relative safety from external and unnatural forces. Well, isn't that what that childish thing that you were calling omnipotence, isn't that what they wanted? And that unnatural force could be a physical threat or some impediment or unlawful deception. And aren't there people that want to protect us from the excesses of capitalism and its mass influence over people? Isn't that a kind of enslavement, if you ask certain people? Okay? So clearly there's some potential ambiguities here in words like unnatural, impediment, deception, private, and so forth. Okay? So what we want to do then is put this under the microscope and be more careful in our definitions and see what this thing is that God has made and is protecting. Because that's what we are caring about here. After all, the name of the class is Christianity and the civil sphere. And so it's not going to appeal to everybody. I think it should, but some people won't be interested in that particular argument. But looking at some of the great political theorists, the idea is the same as Genesis 9, 5, and 6, and we'll see it in the Mosaic Law, so just wait for that. But liberty is proper to man's nature. Liberty is proper to man's nature. That movement, being an intelligent movement, is the way Adam was made. It's part of dominion. But if that's true, that liberty is proper to man's nature, I'm going to draw two more words up here that are a violence. And those two words that I'm going to draw are the more obvious. Let's just shackle the hand right there. Let's shackle that. And we're going to call that the obvious slavery. But then we're gonna put another one right here, and it takes on many forms, and it'll restrict motion, and we'll call that coercion. So slavery and coercion. But if liberty is proper to man's nature, then slavery and coercion is a violence. Now, speaking of slavery, Aristotle argued that many are born by nature slaves. In fact, if you weren't Greek, you qualified. That was Aristotle's basic idea right there. Rutherford cites many divines that, quote, servitude is a penal fruit of sin and against nature. Okay, so 17th century, Scottish Reformed author in Lex Rex, that servitude is a penal fruit of sin. We say, well, it just comes with the fall then. Yes, but it's against nature. Yeah, but that's the original nature. But that design came through. Remember, we laid that foundation in the first couple of sessions. So that duality is crucial there. Liberty is of original nature. The design is retained, and thus the distortion is sin. If you don't believe that, on what grounds do you condemn slavery? You have to believe not only in the image, but that the image implies that free motion. Or what on earth else do you mean by slavery being evil? And so if slavery is the total absence of liberty, coercion is the process of removal. And think of the title to another of Hayek's books, The Road to Serfdom. That it is a process and a tendency and a decline of the same sort. One cannot restrict liberty without some degree of force. And since liberty is natural, the force is violent. And that means that it's violence against the image of God. So all we're doing is just taking a couple of quick inferences that are contained in the truth that is in Scripture. So if you say, I don't see those inferences in Scripture. Yes, but if you see the image in Scripture and laws against violence against it, then these are just a couple of inferences and different ways to say the same thing. Force against that will is violence. And as we'll see later on, if it is granted that economic liberty, in other words, liberty over the dominion of these resources and the voluntary exchange thereof, if that is also a liberty, then, and if coercion is violent force, then to whatever degree economic liberty is restricted, to that same degree, violent force must be used. As has been said, a government cannot control an economy without controlling the people in it. And to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purposes. But why is coercion bad? It's not all the way slavery. It's just, even if it's slow drip slavery, it's not that bad. Well, Hayek answers. He says, quote, "Coercion is evil precisely because it thus eliminates an individual as a thinking and valuing person and makes him a bare tool in the achievement of the ends of another." And there he means another mere mortal. He doesn't mean of God or anything like that. You say, well, that's just Hayek. Well, in biblical terms, that means that some image reduced some other image of God and made him less like an image by force. But what's an image? We've covered this. It's a glory reflector. And so that action detracted glory from God, putting oneself in the place of God, commanding the will of others. And we're not talking about parents to children or an appropriate and temporary situation like this. And Rutherford covers that as well. But lastly, we're stuck with force for force from Genesis 9, 5, and 6. And that's just the seed of it. I understand he only mentions life here, but we'll look at how that flowers out in the law. Or as Hayek said it, coercion, however, cannot be altogether avoided because the only way to prevent it is by the threat of coercion. Free society has met this problem by conferring the monopoly of coercion on the state and by attempting to limit this power of the state to instances where it is required to prevent coercion by private persons. In other words, the only time that force is just is when there's an initiating force, sort of an act of war against the liberty of another. And in that case, that last resort, if you want to just make this really simplistic, that it must be done. And so liberty, or even life as we've seen, can be taken away. Again, we've seen that from Genesis 9, 5, and 6. But then if life can be taken away, and John Locke develops a treatise on government, for that same reason, if life can be taken away for life, then less than that can be removed from someone who has stepped outside the bonds of the covenant. And hence we have jails. And so don't at this point say, but the way that police officers or militaries do this is unjust, and the way that jails are unjust. That may be, but we reform those at the fruit level and not at the root of saying that God made a mistake in that just use of force, okay? We could talk about the ways that it's implemented and fix things there. But in those cases, somebody must be removed to protect the other images of God, and in a proportionate way. You don't kill everybody for stealing a candy bar. Proportionate. Where then is liberty an outgrowth of the image in the Mosaic polity, in the scriptures? Well, first and foremost, in that redemptive event that initiated that whole part of the covenant, that initiated the Mosaic administration in the first place. What was the Exodus but Yahweh's liberation of his image-bearing people from what? from bondage, from slavery. But here's the real punch in the gut to those that reduce natural rights to an Enlightenment construct. Things get thicker. What reason did God tell Moses to tell Pharaoh to hand over their liberty? And the answer is worship. Let my people go, Exodus 5:1, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness, or, as it says more than 6 other times, that they may serve me. Let them go. Let this motion happen so that worship can happen. And you say, well, people don't use their liberty for that. They use it for evil. They do the opposite of what Peter said. Use your freedom for, okay, so therefore chain them up and restrict all worship. Now, I'm not following that. That's a very perverse logic. Here's the deal. To reduce the will that worships is to transfer worship. You cannot be an enemy of liberty without detracting, and purposely so, from the glory of God. Note Paul's nuance in passages like 1 Corinthians 7, this is 6. No, this is 7. 6:23 says another thing. But 7:21 through 23, he says, were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman in the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when called as a bondservant of Christ, you were bought with a price, do not become slaves of men. Now, somebody could look at that same verse and say, yeah, look, half of that language there, and really the upshot is, be content in whatever circumstance you're in. That's true. But he says, if, or to the degree that you can obtain freedom, that freedom is a good. You say, but telling the gospel the other way is also a good. I agree. But why would he say it the way he did if this was not a greater good? And we'll see why that is. Telling the gospel by one's chains is a kind of good, but it's a limited good. Telling the gospel in a diversity of ways, all things being equal, is better. And I understand there's a way that we tell the gospel because we're imitating the way Christ suffered. I understand that. But see, you're not God, and I'm not God. We don't get to subject people to the gospel, meaning whip them. Because, well, you need to go through this because this will tell Jesus' story. We wouldn't do that. That would be a perverse twisting of something that's true made into something that's evil. So, the greater sphere of worship requires a liberated living sacrifice. In Romans 12:1. All in all things being equal, we should prefer more opportunities to worship rather than less, over the less. Now, what were the laws on slavery and what do they tell us? Well, first, from Exodus 21, such a slave shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing. Exodus 21:1. But then it's added on top of that, when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally. Deuteronomy 15:13 through 14. Now, I've argued against the whole slavery's in the Bible thing. I mentioned it 2 times ago, but elsewhere in other series I've argued against it more in detail. And so I'm just going to have to, refer you to those. But notice here that when they had this form of indentured servitude, and it's talking about Hebrew slaves at this point, that you are to furnish him liberally. You are to make sure that he's really free. Why? Because he's an image of God. There's another reason. Because you were slaves and I got you out of there. And that logic recurs again and again. And the moral aspect of the death penalty for the slave trader. So cutting it at the root because it was destined to fade away because of the biblical worldview and only because of the biblical worldview. And it's reaffirmed in 1 Timothy 1:10. And so we have to remember that liberty is grounded in the image of God. And Paul put his money where his mouth was, applying the gospel to Philemon, this convert who had a slave, because 2/3 of the Roman Empire were comprised of slaves. And he urged the master to be reconciled to his slave Onesimus. And he says in verse 16 of Philemon, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother. The image of God on this side and the gospel of Jesus Christ does something to slavery that no other view does. But the last straw of the covenant with Judah, northern kingdom was already taken away. Judah had been given a last chance and a last chance and a last chance. And in Jeremiah 34, what was that last straw for God? It was over slavery. King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to make a proclamation of liberty to them, that everyone should set free his Hebrew slaves, male and female, so that no one should enslave a Jew, his brother. That came from that law in Exodus 21. And they disobeyed the clear instructions about that seventh year. They went back on it. And so it says in verse 16, you turned around and profaned my name when each of you took back his male and female slaves, whom you had set free according to their desire. God says you've profaned his name when you have enslaved images of God. Well, the desire is bad. That you're not God. You don't get to decide that. God is Lord of them, therefore set them free. Other models of liberty. I mentioned John Stuart Mill, and it's worth mentioning. His book in 1859, it was called On Liberty. And Mill acknowledges that things were changing. And he doesn't get everything right in his view of liberty either. But he acknowledges the historical stages, such as not just in the French Revolution, but what was brewing in Central Europe as a whole, courtesy of Hegel, that the will of the state began to be identified with the will of the people, such that impediments to liberty, and it goes right back to this third definition, this was taking over. Impediments to liberty were now impediments to state power, to bring about the common good. What is liberty? Well, we are not able to produce X result. He observed that the will of the majority rarely is any will of any majority, but rather Mill says, quote, the will of the most active part of the people, the majority, or those who succeed in making themselves accepted as the majority. In other words, the biggest loudmouths, the ones who know how to play the game, Mill is saying. Now, Mill is clearly libertarian in denying the right of force for anything other than to prevent violence against the self, not even to protect others from themselves. So he orders this essence of liberty, and he goes from in here, from the inward domain of consciousness, that's what I mean first, the mind, and Mill says that has to include speaking and writing. If I don't have the liberty to speak as I please and publish as I please, then I don't really have a full liberty of consciousness. That has to extend to what he called tastes and pursuits. Now, what does he mean by taste? Don't worry about that yet, but now he's going out here, that pursuit of happiness, as long as it doesn't harm others, he says. And then thirdly, of assembling into groups of the same. That if I actually have that liberty of mind and motion, that I also ought to be able to converse with others and assemble with them under that same heading. And Mill most famously identifies what he called the tyranny of the majority. And yet his contribution was pitting that that tyranny against what he thought of the eccentric or the creative genius, and it was held back by a spirit of Puritanism in Victorian England. So it's kind of dated in that sense. But on the other hand, it does, and I'm mentioning him because his view of liberty has fueled modern liberalism ever since. And the view of many, including people like T.S. Eliot and others, Santayana and others since then in the 20th century, is that liberalism, unlike well, I guess they're alike in one sense. Conservatism holds the fort down. Like, forget about what the labels are used as now. Just analyze the word itself, etymology. Conservatism is holding a fort of some sort. That can be good or bad. Liberalism, T.S. Eliot said, is defined not so much by what it is, more so what is it escaping from. Again, that child impulse, that person running away without any regard to where he's going and so forth. That's oversimplifying it, but that's Eliot's point there. And some of that was taken from Mill. Good ideas wandering off the reservation. Now, here's another idea to throw into the mix, speaking of the French and liberty, equality, fraternity. The true relationship between liberty and equality. Because guess what? If you define liberty in these kind of ways, really what that desired state actually is a manifestation of this. Now you might say, now just a second there, Matt. I'd really like it if you, whatever you do with that, if you would also put that word over here like you're doing with life, liberty, and property. Why don't you put that over there? Okay, I'll take you up on that. That's fair enough because there's a sense in which that is there. Samuel Rutherford in Lex Rex couples with natural liberty, quote, that all men are born by nature of equal condition. You know that heading on the Supreme Court, equality before the law. Probably butchering it. I'm really tired right now. But equality, but you know the phrase, equality before the law. And that's the concept of justice, which we'll do a week on that too. But I think we can agree that there's a kind of equality that is founded here. Now, if the soul does not exist and all we are is animals, speaking of other worldviews, from where is equality derived? What is equal about people, if not this conception? There's nothing equal about size, speed, intelligence, circumstance, opportunity. There's absolutely nothing relevantly equal about us that would constitute what we mean by a modern liberal society with rights. And so that equality has to have a different ground. But if that equality has a different ground, then it's not equality of outcomes. And we'll see why in a second. It's this equality of having life, liberty, and property. That what we would mean by equality is really just a synonym or a euphemism for this image of God. And we would agree completely. But modern liberalism, taking Locke further off the reservation to Mill, further off the reservation to what John Rawls, who we'll look at. But modern liberalism contained both of these twin pillars, liberty and equality, that once they're torn from their biblical moorings, once they're torn from their natural law foundations, become something radically different. They become monsters, warring against themselves and each other. And speaking of radically different, in another good book, Slouching Toward Gomorrah, it was written in 1996, Robert Bork once observed this very incoherence within modern liberalism, without those natural roots in the order of things. But liberalism just sort of taking these two pillars to wherever. Bork says, quote, the defining characteristics of modern liberalism are radical egalitarianism, that is the equality of outcomes rather than of opportunities, and radical individualism, the drastic reduction of limits to personal gratification. Don't worry, libertarian friends, not individualism in this natural sense, but here, or probably here, that radical individualism these pillars descending from these off the reservation definitions of it. So Bork says, these may seem an odd pair because individualism means liberty and liberty produces inequality. While, on the other side, equality of outcomes means coercion and coercion destroys liberty. So you see, there's a tension. And Bork says, if they are to operate simultaneously, radical egalitarianism and radical individualism, where they would compete, must be kept apart, must operate in different areas of life. By the way, this is one of the reasons why that humorous moment happens all the time. And it would be comical if it weren't so tragic, and people probably are not laughing anymore, of when the left finds itself at war with itself. Some of that's just intersectionality, which we'll get to in Marxist theory. But some of it's just good old-fashioned liberalism wandering off the reservation with two pillars that are set against each other as if they weren't. And you wind up with these incoherences. You wind up with these tensions. Because pressed, they don't go together. In fact, pressed, they're not even themselves anymore. Now, there's a lot there. But the part we want to see here at this basic stage is that liberty and equality exist in a tension. If liberty is maximized, natural inequalities result. But if liberty is natural and unnatural equalities are pressed or forced, then such cannot be done without violence. And consequently, what we're going to argue is forced equality of outcomes requires violence against the image of God. And we will see this clearly about the 8th commandment and the 10th commandment. But what I also want to show you is that it must also be true about the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 9th as well. You cannot press forced equality of outcomes without it sending a ripple effect throughout the entire second table of the law. The natural property of liberty in the image of God runs through that whole second table. Now, finally, the ugly essence of authoritarianism. You know, when God made commandments, he made them in concert with man's nature. He knew what he was doing. When you violate those, in addition to violating God's law, the machine breaks down. You violate the nature of man. And so there's going to be something psychologically and sociologically unhealthy about it as well. It stands to reason. There's an ugly essence of authoritarianism. That bully, that abuser, that seeking to control the will of others, that loathsome personality that we say when we're children we all loathe. Charles Hodge once said that there is a pope in every bosom. But perhaps, turning outward to society, there's also a petty dictator there as well. And if the lockdowns taught us anything, it's that there's no shortage among our neighbors of applicants for the head of the new secret police. But what does it say as a Christian? What does it say of a person to lord it over another? Jesus said of the citizens of his kingdom, you know, and this is Mark 10, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, that their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. He didn't mean that authority is bad, because Romans 13:1 said all authority comes from God. So he's not talking about office or position. He's talking about a manner of doing it. It's quite obvious. This incessant desire to stop other adults. We're not talking about children, again, or appropriate relationships or temporary arrangements, such as, for example, that submission that is rendered from members to a head of a covenant, to a boss, and so forth. But to lord it over. Dominion was made for man over nature, not man over man. And we may well ask whether or not any coordinated effort, in other words, any political philosophy, to bind the will of others is not both a psychological disorder and a demonic movement of souls to steal the individual image's free movement toward God in worship and in virtuous action. So we'll stop there, and next time we'll talk about that third one, the right to property.